Let's talk to Sir Desmond Swayne. He's former International Development Minister and a Conservative MP who's been speaking out very loudly and long time against the lockdown. Good morning to you, Sir Desmond.
Good morning.
Good morning. What did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say yesterday about how he would be haunted for as long as he lives by the COVID pandemic? An awful lot of the questions that we had at the press conference last night to mark the first year anniversary of going into our first lockdown were about sort of his regrets and about the deaths that we were marking, 126,000 confirmed COVID deaths with COVID on the death toll now. Do you think his regrets would also extend, and the haunting will also extend to the damage done to the economy, to people's lives, to the cancer treatments not taken, the suicides, the mental health problems, the children who weren't educated for a year, and indeed all the damage to our civil liberties? Do you think that will haunt him as well?
I do believe it will. The key issue for me is to what does he attribute all those problems? My concern is that actually we've misdiagnosed the issues and the mistakes. Yes, of course, mistakes will always be made. We're human beings. We're fallible. But my fear is that there's a misdiagnosis. The concentration is, we should have gone into lockdown earlier and more fiercely and sustained it harder. Actually, given the problems that you have just enumerated and which we will have to live with years, my view is actually we've misdiagnosed it. We should never have gone into lockdown. All those deaths, those terrible 126,000 deaths, the vast majority of them come from clearly defined groups that we perhaps should have been much more creative about incentivizing to shield, and the rest of us should have got on with normal lives, avoiding the disastrous consequences for the economy, for education, for mental health, and for other health conditions.
And this is it. I wonder if this question is even going to come up at the public inquiry, because everything it will happen eventually. Everything is very much geared along the lines of, should we have locked down sooner? Should we have locked down, as you say, longer? Should we have locked down more strictly? We are currently in one of the strictest lockdowns in the world at this current time, and we've got deaths plummeting, infections plummeting. We've got this extraordinary success of the rollout of the vaccine, and yet we are still in this. I mean, it's March the 24th, and we're not told we're not going to expect proper freedom, as in just some semblance of normal life, until June the 21st, almost 3 months away. Were you at the 1922 committee meeting, which is the backbencher MPs committee meeting with Boris Johnson last night? And were questions asked about when these restrictions will be lifted, given the huge success that we have seen?
Well, meetings of the 1922 committee, I'm afraid I have this rather quaint view that meetings of the 1922 committee are supposed to be confidential.
Well, not anymore.
And treat that seriously. Clearly, some others do not. But of course, proper concerns were raised along the lines that you suggest. And my fear is that, one thing about lockdowns is they appear to have become habit forming. There's a tendency to be cautious and to hang on to them and to lose the proper sense of urgency about the devastating costs at which they come. Billions of pounds a day, mental health, education, all the issues that continue to build up for every day that we remain in lockdown.
I know you say you believe this meeting last night was confidential, but given that it has been divulged by a number of different MPs to sources, that Boris Johnson said that the UK's successful vaccine rollout was thanks to greed and capitalism. This has been taken rather badly in some parts of the media, but the context in which he said this was what?
Well, I don't. Let me speculate as to what may or may not have been said. The reality is that, as Adam Smith said, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. The reality is that capitalism, that free enterprise, initiative, effort delivers much faster economic advance and growth, and that's applicable to our vaccine program as anything else. But a key point that was made was that actually here was the British government on behalf of the British taxpayer intervening and providing seed funding early for this enterprise so that it could be provided at cost.
Yes, the AstraZeneca jab is the only jab being provided at cost, isn't it?
And that is something that the British government invested in early on behalf of the taxpayer, on behalf of the world. This will now be supplied to the rest of the world at cost rather than a profit. That is a huge, I think, commitment from the government, and goes well beyond what might be called the self-interest of capitalism.
Okay, let me ask you more about self-interest in terms of the EU. It looks like Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, and others are basically doubling down on this their vaccine rollout failures and vaccine procurement failures. The EU now are talking about cutting vaccines exports across the world to any country that has higher vaccination rates than them. What do you make of that?
It's stupidity, because in the long term, it sends a powerful message to anyone who might have thought that they would invest their capital and their enterprise in Europe, that it is not safe, that it will be interfered with when it becomes, when there's a matter of interest on the part of the European Union itself. It will interfere, appropriate your capital, and tell you what you may and may not do in economic terms. I think it's a hugely self-harming attempt to cover their own mistakes.
And in terms of that jab rollout, Front of the Telegraph today is saying that we're going to see the jab rollout not just for adults, as the vaccines have been tested on previously, but the ongoing testing now of children that's going on. We're going to be seeing the rollout of the jabs to children. Given that children are at extraordinarily low risk of getting ill or dying of this virus, and we don't, for most children, unless they're particularly unhealthy, we don't give them, for instance, the flu jab, even though they're actually at higher risk of dying of flu than they are from COVID. Should we be rolling out these vaccines to children?
Oh, well, I think that's a question that I would be much more interested in an answer from clinicians than from a politician like myself. But let's face it, as a child, I had polio jabs. I wasn't in any great danger of catching polio. BCG. As a child, I had all sorts of injections before traveling abroad. So I certainly have no difficulty with the principle of children being vaccinated. Again, yes, of course, they're at very low risk of suffering adversely from the disease. That's why they're at the end of the queue. So why we're only thinking about doing children now. But nevertheless, children can transmit it. So I have no difficulty in principle with vaccinating children, so long as it remains a matter of choice on the part of their parents. But it certainly wouldn't be a priority. You're quite right to draw attention to the fact that children do not suffer, and the evidence that they are the vectors in spreading it is, limited, to say the least.
Well, indeed, as we've seen with the falling death rate, falling hospital admission rates, and falling infections at a time when children are back at school. What a surprise! Let's talk about the prospect of, course, kids are mostly going into their Easter holidays at the end of this week or so, and then of course we've got the summer holidays ahead. We know Easter. I mean, we were told to sacrifice Christmas in return for January, and then we were told to sacrifice January and February in return for Easter. Not getting Easter either, but a lot of people go, well, don't worry, we're going to get our summer holidays. Good luck trying to book anywhere nice for your summer holidays here in Blighty right now. Those are pretty much all been booked up since last year, but lots of people still holding out for a foreign summer holiday. Now there's a lot of talk that may not happen as well. Now we're told that the foreign holiday or foreign travel restrictions we're going to get a new announcement before the 5th of April. How likely do you think it is that we will end up with effectively still a complete border control, ban on travel for anything other than emergency reasons or business reasons, and actually we're all going to be here for the duration?
Well, the pitch is clearly being rolled for that with these statements that are being made by scientists and one or two politicians. So I'm nervous about that. Again, it seems to me a loss of a proper sense of proportion and the moving of the goalposts. Because remember, The whole purpose of lockdown in the first place was to protect the NHS from being overwhelmed with hospital admissions. That was the key deliverable. Those were the goalposts. The difficulty is that, when you've got travel to Europe and new variants and this question about whether the vaccines are as effective, all the evidence shows that whilst the vaccines won't stop you from catching the new variants, it stops you from being seriously ill and therefore being hospitalized as a consequence. So if we had stuck with the original goalposts, we would not be fretting now about foreign travel. As for what happens at Easter, we have votes tomorrow. Yep. On the new regulations, the continuation of the Coronavirus Act and new regulations governing the unlocking. And I think that politicians need to be clear in their own minds, as we saw last week, where all those siren voices complaining about the way the police had enforced rules that Parliament had imposed. Are we really saying to people, you cannot have your family come and stay at Easter, and we expect the police to enforce this with heavy fines and to pry into your private arrangements about what you're doing? We need to be absolutely clear that if Parliament votes for these regulations, that's what they're saying.
Yeah, and they're not allowed to then, when the story emerges of some little old lady getting fined in her back garden for having a cup of tea or maybe meeting her family to share an Easter egg, they're not allowed to then say this is outrageous and the police should have shown discretion. No, you voted for that law. That is literally what you said should happen.